This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this special edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and once again I'm joined by my colleague Scott Cutler with the NYSE Euronext. And Scott, here we are, second year at the annual Boardroom Summit. Big room behind us, all the people are off meeting and their peer collaboration, but we get to do this special game day version of This Week in the Boardroom.
Exactly. I just need a pinstripe suit and a purple tie or something.
Yeah, and you know, usually the person that's in your seat has the head of the mascot that they bring out. So our audience is going to be waiting to see if, you know, what you pull out as far as...
I just need the Terry Bradshaw big hands.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's also our pleasure to welcome Phil Lochner, who's the former SEC Commissioner, a current director, and our guest today, and we have a plethora of topics to talk about with you, Phil, so it's a pleasure to have you here on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
First of all, let me sort of set the stage. Phil, you have sort of done it all when you think of what we could have in the way of an experienced guest on, and just let me review some of these things. You've been a corporate lawyer with Cravath. You were at Time Warner, where you held various legal and administrative positions like General Counsel and Chief Administrative Officer. You served as Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Law at the State University of New York Law School. You served on the board of the Investor Responsibility Research Center. You were an SEC Commissioner, and subsequently you have sat on 11 boards. So if we can't qualify you as the perfect guest, then I'm not sure there's much future in This Week in the Boardroom.
A mile wide and an inch deep.
Well, Scott just, for your first challenge, Scott just finished a session where he talked about executive compensation, and here's a case where we have mandating the say on pay, good spirit, you know, in the law of what's trying to be done, but it creates all these, what I call unintended consequences or distractions. Can you talk a little bit about the whether that truly helps the investor when you're creating a distraction for the directors that takes their eye off the ball and they seem to be spending time on all these distractive issues?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. At least initially, the first year or a couple of years when we've got say on pay, I think it will be a distraction. But like a lot of things, it'll eventually, I think, become more routine and take less time of the board and less time of management. And frankly, you know, corporations are under a lot of scrutiny. Say on pay is a political response in part to that scrutiny. It's not an unhealthy thing for shareholders to feel like they've got some say in an issue that really is resonant with them. So overall, I'm not sure it's a bad thing, and the number of companies that'll actually be negatively affected, A, is very small, and frankly, they probably should be affected.
What's your best advice today? We're in a challenging economic environment, a lot of volatility in the marketplace. What do you say to a board or a director that thinks that the strategy that the company is on is best for the long term, but may be at odds with either the proxy advisory firms
right.
or institutions in the short term?
Right. You know, it's a tough situation. You know, my advice is communicate. Too often companies leave in a traditional IR function all their communications with shareholders. I think you got to go beyond that. You've got to find new ways to reach your shareholder base and communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it. It's not always going to be successful, frankly, but I don't see that you have much choice if you believe in your long-term strategy.
Phil, you had mentioned the say on pay and that, but are you a fan of shareholders participating sort of on this regular basis. I've always taken a position that I understand the need to have them involved in the process of electing who's going to represent them. That to me is illogical. It makes sense for them to participate in that. What doesn't make sense to me, which none of us would want as executives, is somebody sitting on your shoulder, okay, literally repeatedly watching each decision and action that's made. So we don't know if say on pay is the last say on something. Okay.
Right.
But it just seems to me to be a derisive kind of policy that, once they're elected, you got to let them do their job. Then if they don't do a good job, then you replace them, but don't sit on their shoulder.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. In fact, I think a number of years ago, Marty Lipton had a terrific idea, which was you ought to elect directors every 5 years, not every year. Give the board an opportunity to perform over some reasonable length of time. And you're right, now it's an annual review, and it gets into specific issues like pay. Unfortunately, it's the world we live in. I don't see it changing. So you've got to learn to cope with the situation we've got.
What we talked about actually in one of the panels this morning about one of the trends that we see today in governance. And that trend is really, if you looked at 10 years ago, one critique of a board might be that they would weigh too much of the potential risk of litigation as guiding certain decisions. And today, maybe boards are spending more time thinking about what ISS might say about a particular provision. What's your best advice to say to directors in terms of what they should be focused on?
Certainly litigation is way down my list of things you should focus on. There may be sort of life-threatening litigation that a company gets involved with, which is a different matter. But I think as somebody said on it might have been your panel, almost no matter what you do, you're going to be sued. The plaintiff's bar is very active. They're looking, frankly, for a payoff. It doesn't really have to do with the fundamentals of how you run the business. So that's way down my list. I think it's really about people, strategy, products, markets. All the traditional things are what I think boards should focus on.
So if a friend came to you today and said, should I serve on a board, would your answer be yes, that it's a rewarding process?
Oh, it's certainly, I find it personally rewarding. I enjoy the involvement and the rest. The advice is do your homework before you agree to serve, and I find now that candidates to go on boards are talking to the outside auditors, the outside counsel, as many board members as they can meet, as many members of senior management as they can meet. The second thing is recognize that from the outside, no matter how good things look, you really won't know till you get on the board to start participating in meetings. I've seen companies with terrific formal structures of governance, and you get in there and the reality is, everybody nods at the CEO and does whatever he suggests. So I guess my other piece of advice is, if it doesn't look good after the first year, get off. Don't think, somehow this is all going to improve. Odds are probably that it won't. Then the other thing is you got to watch out for your personal liability. Companies ought to have the right bylaws and charter provisions and D&O insurance and individual director liability coverage. And that's sort of a necessity. But, the overall experience I think is great. And if you think you have something to contribute, fantastic.
Well, I can't think of a more qualified person, at least on paper, on serving as a director. Not having served with you for the very reason that you said, but I can't think of...
Is this a Bill Walton of MVP in name only?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on. You're certainly the kind of guest that we like to have on the show. We wish you the best of luck on those boards that you are working with. We're sure you're going to do a good job for them. And again, thanks for being on the show. And from Scott and I, that sort of concludes our first remote session here from our annual Boardroom Summit. We actually will come back to you shortly because we're taking good advantage of this opportunity and a lot of the guests that are here at our conference. So with that, we'll look forward to seeing you next week and another good special remote edition of This Week in the Boardroom. Thanks for joining us.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.